Hi guys, this is Tamara. Thank you so much for coming back to my channel. Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the perpetuating features and factors of intergenerational trauma. And basically what that convoluted statement means, guys, is that I want to talk about the things that helps perpetuate the negative impact of intergenerational trauma within our families and within our culture as well. I think there's a lot of information in this video that may be helpful, and it can kind of help you understand how intergenerational trauma gets transmitted over generations in a family. So let's just go ahead and jump in. Thank you so much for coming back to my channel. For those who are subscribed and for those who are new, I encourage you to hit the subscribe button so you can stick around with us and be a part of our growing community. The benefits for you in today's video is that I'm going to highlight how intergenerational trauma gets transmitted. I'm sorry guys, my camera went out of focus there. How intergenerational trauma impacts us, and I want to talk about how it gets transmitted throughout generations, okay? So let's just go ahead and jump in. I'm going to be talking about three different categories, and these are three different categories based on my research, my experience, and based on what I have talked about in the past through interviews and articles I've written and things like that. There are three important categories that I like to zone in on and focus in on, okay? And so I have my list here, my notes, to kind of help keep me focused. But I want to point out the three categories that I think really does help to transmit intergenerational trauma throughout generations. The first category is socioeconomic status and environment. Okay, socioeconomic status and environment. The second category is race, class, and culture. Race, class, and culture. All right, that's number two. Race, class, and culture. And number three is the psychological and emotional aspects of trauma. The psychological and emotional aspects of trauma. All right, so these are the three categories, the three big categories: socioeconomic status and environment, race, culture, and class. And then we also have the psychological and emotional aspects of trauma. All right, so intergenerational trauma, I'm going to give you a little bit of a definition. I'm going to remind you of the definition. It's the concept that a trauma has happened. And instead of that individual getting help and working through that trauma and, really being able to rise above the trauma, instead of being able to do that, right, they maintain the trauma by not getting help. They maintain the trauma by refusing counseling, by refusing to talk about it, by pushing it under the carpet and the rug and saying that it didn't happen. All right. So intergenerational trauma gets transmitted when that family member has a child or marries or has a new relationship, an additional relationship that requires that interpersonal closeness and interaction. That gets kind of muddied by that unresolved trauma, and that begins to get perpetuated throughout those generations. That's really the way I like to look at that. So let's say, for example, you have a grandmother, great-grandmother, and she's from a tribe where they experienced a ton of bloodshed and a ton of abuse. Okay, she never got help for her father's father. She never got help for kind of vicariously hearing about her father's trauma. Okay, I'll use that example. She also may be struggling with her own internal trauma, right? So her own trauma from the things she's experienced in her own life. Those two things together, excuse me, have to get some kind of treatment. Because if not, she's going to internalize her emotions and her thoughts, and she's going to transmit it on to the next generation, which would be her daughter, who has had you. And you're the younger generation, but now you're being impacted by your mother because your mother has been impacted by her mother. Okay, so that is intergenerational trauma. It gets transmitted through unresolved trauma and unresolved grief and loss. Okay, so these categories is they're basically what I like to focus on, because these are things that impact not only your family but my family, and they are also things that can impact us through culture. Right, through the African American culture, through the Native American and Cherokee tribes, right, through the African culture, through the Italian culture. There's a generation, even the German culture, right? There's generations and generations of trauma there, and these categories tend to be the most impacted. All right, so when I'm thinking of socioeconomic status and environment, the way that intergenerational trauma, gets transmitted is through a lack of access to mental health or medical services, okay? So you have a family member who has had a trauma, right? Or they have had a traumatic brain injury, or they have had a medical condition that has brought on psychological and emotional trauma. If they don't get help because they don't have access to the resources, and if they don't get help because they don't have access to the therapist that they need, to the resources to get that therapist, to the insurance, to the income, whatever it may be, if they don't have that physical access, that trauma is going to get transmitted and perpetuated, right? It's going to get transmitted to the next generation. If we have a family who does not believe in counseling, who does not believe in psychotherapy, who does not believe in medication, who does not believe in talking about problems and processing it and examining it and growing and learning and changing, then, you know, we're going to have a problem down the line as well, because again, their unresolved issues are going to get transmitted onto the next generation and transmitted onto the next family member, right? So that's one way to look at that. Another way that it gets transmitted is exposure to gangs and violence. Now, if you have had some kind of exposure or your loved one to gangs and violence, they're going to perpetuate that mindset to the next generation if they don't do anything about how they think and see things. That attitude and that mentality is going to get transmitted on to the next generation. Also, research suggests that a high percentage of individuals who are exposed to neighborhood violence, community violence, gangs, whatever, those individuals begin to show mental health and behavioral and emotional symptoms that need to be taken care of, okay? So that's going to get transmitted on to the next generation. Another way is family members who refuse mental and emotional as well as medical services just because of fear, right? So anxiety and fear over medical and mental health services can also be transmitted on to the next generation. That loved one or family member just feels like, nope, I don't trust the medical system. Nope, I don't trust the mental health system. I'm not going. And then they end up perpetuating that same mentality onto the next generation. So it becomes a family culture, right? All of these things that I'm talking about in this category becomes a family culture, and that can help transmit intergenerational trauma onto the next generation. All right. The last part of this category of socioeconomic status and environment is self-esteem and self-efficacy. Your feelings of self-efficacy, right? So feeling that you are effective in what you do, feeling that you are competent and confident, that you are self-assured, right? That you are courageous, that you are able to do things. You know, a family member who has some deficiencies in that area is going to perpetuate that onto the next generation, right? Because they themselves don't feel good about themselves. Whatever their issues are, whether that's self-esteem or personality, or that's cultural, or, you know, that's class, right? I feel like I'm not about much of anything, or I come from a culture that's been prejudiced again, that has been faced with prejudice, I should say, or that has been discriminated against, or, you know, that has experienced racism because of the color of their skin or because of the class that they're at, right? If you have those things and they're unresolved, it's going to get perpetuated on to the next generation. It's a mindset, right? It's almost like those things possess how you see yourself and how you think about yourself, and that gets transmitted on to the next generation. So that doesn't help at all. So these things in this category really have a lot to do with your psyche and how you see things and how you experience life and perceive it. And so if it doesn't get dealt with from, you know, the core, right? If it doesn't get dealt with from where it started, then it's going to get transmitted and perpetuated onto the next generation. All right, so that's category one that I focus on in my discussions about intergenerational trauma. The second category is about race, culture, and class. Okay, so this is category two. And what I like to focus on here is something that I talk about in this video right up here. It's a content attitude. The content attitude gets perpetuated onto the next generation. All right, a content attitude is this. Okay, so, you know, I come from a low socioeconomic status household, and my dad worked in a blue-collar job, and my mom, you know, worked as a waitress, and we come from the Bronx. Okay, this is an example. We come from the Bronx, and, you know, I kind of got content with coming from the Bronx, saying I came from there, I grew up there, I lived there, whatever. I'm content with that. But now I have decided to live in the Bronx, and I've decided to take a job with very bad wages, and I've decided to have children out of wedlock, and have about 5 or 6 kids. And you know what? That's life for me. As long as I'm content, as long as I have, you know, a roof over my head and my children, I'm content with this, because it's too hard to try to make something of myself. It's too hard to try to move forward and be better. It's too hard to try to fight against the forces of prejudice and racism and institutionalized discrimination to make it somewhere. So I think I'm going to be content right where I'm at, right? It's too much to fight against the forces of higher socioeconomic status and the middle class and the higher class. I think I'm just going to stay down here and be just fine with where I'm at. That is a content attitude, all right? And that is like a poison, you know? And that gets transmitted onto children. It gets transmitted onto their children, onto their children, right? Their spouses. It just goes for generations. That content mentality and disposition is something that children can sense, right? You don't even have to say it. They sense it. They know it. They know if you're content, and they know if you want to get out or if you want to stay. So that content attitude is, you know, something that I see that transmits intergenerational trauma. The next is maintaining discriminatory views. All right, maintaining discriminatory views. And I've had this in my family because we're multicultural, we're multi-ethnic, and so there's different views and different cultures and different races, and there's biracial, and the list goes on. There's mixed, there's Native American, there's like, so my family is basically the melting pot, if you ask me, based on my DNA studies and how my family behaves and acts and their beliefs and so forth. And there are inborn discriminatory views, and I've been around them for decades, and it is just hard for me to swallow when I'm around it. And so I'm sure you know the feeling, right? If you come from a German family, Italian family, a predominantly Caucasian family, if you come from a deep South family, if you come from a predominantly African-American family, if you come from a Native American family that's tribal, and they're really fixated on their history, you're probably going to hear some discriminatory views that are, you know, pretty dated, right? You know, dated like dinosaur time views, you know? And those views can really be perpetuated and transmitted throughout generations. And the sad part about that is that it limits the modern generation, right? It limits you and your perspective. My perspective as a 30-something-year-old, right? It also limits your children's perspective, because if your grandfather had that view and passed it to you, you're most likely gonna pass it on, unless you get education and you see life differently. But other than that, it's gonna get transferred, and that's really racism, right? That's how racism started. That's how classism started. That's how sexism started, right? Because it started somewhere from no knowledge. It started somewhere with limited education, and it got perpetuated. All right, so you know, I focus on that as well. That's something that can happen with intergenerational trauma, the maintaining of discriminatory views. All right. The next is minimizing others and belittling them. That can get transmitted as well. So again, we're in the category of race, class, and discrimination, or culture, I should say. You know, minimizing other people's, you know, character, and minimizing other people's self-worth and belittling them can get transmitted. And it does. It gets transmitted in predominantly Caucasian families, and predominantly African-American families, and predominantly tribal families. There's this predominant view that, you know, a certain culture, class, or race of people, or even age of people, age group, are a certain way, and that attitude gets transmitted throughout generations. All right, so this is category 2, race, culture, and what did I say? Race, culture, and class. The last category that I tend to focus on that perpetuates intergenerational trauma is the psychology and emotional aspects of trauma. All right, number 1, psychological and emotional abuse. If you are in a family where psychological and emotional abuse happens, it's most likely going to get transmitted to the next generation, okay? Have you heard those family members that say things like, you know, I got beaten, my dad beat me till I couldn't see anymore, and I think I'm going to beat my children the same way? I've heard that so many times in various cultures, not just in African-American culture, not just in Caucasian culture. I've heard it in various cultures, okay? And it perpetuates psychological and emotional trauma. It really does, because, you know, you shouldn't have to beat your kids to get them to listen to you. Do I believe in corporal punishment? No, I'm like not for that. I try to encourage a different way. Does it work for some kids, and is it needed for some kids? Perhaps, and I can't blame those families that use it. But I'm talking about abuse here. I'm talking about beating your kid bloody, or beating your kid so they have marks or welts. I think that if that attitude of I got beat, I'm going to beat you gets perpetuated, it's going to create psychological and emotional trauma. And what I have seen in counseling my families is that trauma really does, it takes a hold of that generation, and sometimes that behavior can actually turn out to be worse. You know, it can turn out to be worse than what the previous generation did. And that's the sad part. All right. So the psychological and emotional abuse. The next one is domestic violence. Domestic violence gets perpetuated as well. Okay. If it's not taken care of, if it's not dealt with appropriately, if it's not, you know, stopped in a timely manner, it gets perpetuated. Children who live underneath that domestic violence and that trauma also begin to believe that it's normal, and it gets normalized, and it gets generalized, and before you know it, that becomes a way of life. All right. The next is narcissistic abuse, and I have a video right up here that I did, and I'll share it with you guys in the description box as well, where I talk about narcissistic abuse. That gets perpetuated as well. All right. Traumatic bonding, I talk about it in the video right up here. That gets transmitted throughout generations and becomes intergenerational trauma. And last but not least, I have here on my list complex trauma, and that gets perpetuated as well. Okay, and I talk about complex trauma right up here. These are the things that often perpetuates intergenerational trauma, and it maintains it throughout generations. So if you have noticed this pattern in your family, I encourage you to let me know in the comment section below what this looks like in your life, in your family. Stay tuned for the next video, guys. I will be back on Friday and then again on Sunday with this continual topic. We're going to continue to talk about it. So let me know what you're thinking in the comment section below, and I will see you soon with another video. All right, thank you.